الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله سيد المرسلين وخاتم النبيين ورحمة للعالمين وصلى الله على آله الطاهرين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا أوصيكم عباد الله ونفسي بتقوى الله. In today's khutbah, I would like to talk about one of the important issues as far as the social ill in this society is concerned. In the last 30 or more years, we have been seeing regular reports issued by World Health Organization about the harms of alcohol to human society. Against the promotion which comes from the industry, where they say Mediterranean diet or red wine, little bit is better for your heart, but the health organizations are always on the other side. And then, for example, about 15 years ago, there was a report published in Lancet, a very prestigious medical journal, by Dr. David Nutt, who was the head of the Independent Scientific Committee of Drugs in UK. And he basically described alcohol as a more dangerous drug than heroin or crack. And this is where cocaine basically. And he basically had a 16-point, measure by which he compared all different drugs. And, the number one, means he had this, the score out of 100. At the top, you have alcohol as 62 points. Later on, heroin comes 55 and crack comes 54. And on the personal level, of course, alcohol was, not number one, it was number 4. But when it comes to the impact on others around the family or circle or the society, alcohol again became number 1. And so we see this trend going on as far as the medical officials are concerned. They don't hesitate in saying that alcohol is a problem. Last week, the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Murthy, issued an advisory that alcohol drinks should carry a label warning consumers about their cancer risks. They have this for cigarettes. Very scary pictures that sometimes I see. But when it comes to alcohol, it is completely a different, perspective there. And especially, he says, it should be clarified on the labels about the increasing risk of developing breast, colon, liver, and other cancers, as well as birth defects, which are already there on the label, I'm told, according to that report. Now, according to him, alcohol consumption is the 3rd leading preventable cause of cancer in the U.S., increasing risk for at least 7 types of cancer. Alcohol is responsible for 100,000 U.S. cancer cases and 20,000 cancer deaths every year. More than 13,500 alcohol-associated traffic crash deaths. And so even on a personal level, it is something which is, they have to think about it. And this brings us back to the Quran. revealed upon the Prophet 14 centuries ago. And this is where, I say many times we say, oh, maybe Islam is outdated and this and that. Remember, a day will come, people will come back to where we have been following from day one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in different ayat, but I would like to share with you two of them. Surah Al-Ma'idah, one of the last surahs, ayat number 90 and 91, where he says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِنَّمَا الْخَمْرُ وَالْمَيْسِرُ وَالْأَنصَابُ وَالْأَزْلَامُ رِجْسٌ مِّنْ عَمَلِ الشَّيْطَانِ. He says, oh, you who believe, verily intoxicants and gambling of different kinds, ansab, azlam, these are rijsun min amal shaitan. It is an abomination, it is an evil from the action or the deeds of shaitan. Fashtanibuhu. Refrain from it, stay away from it, لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ, so that you may be successful. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually talks about the role of intoxicants as one of the weapons used by the shaitan. In the next ayat he says, إِنَّمَا يُرِيدُ الشَّيْطَانُ أَنْ يُوقَعَ بَيْنَكُمْ عَلَى الْعَدَاوَةِ وَالْبَغْضَاءِ فِي الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسَرِ. Two things he mentions. That verily the shaitan wants to create animosity and hatred among you. So we are talking about not medical problems here, we're talking about social ills. From family life to friendship and community and other problems, that shaitan uses the khamr and the maisar, alcohol and gambling, as a means of creating animosity and hatred among you. وَيَصُدُّكُمْ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَعَنِ الصَّلَاةِ. And also on a spiritual level, it basically prevents you from remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and from salat. فَهَلْ أَنْتُمْ مُنْتَهُونَ. So are you going to refrain from it? Very clear about it. And this is where we have to realize, when it comes to the issue of social ills, the medical science talked about it on as far as the physical, implications and the cancer and things like that. But on a level of, social ills, shaitan uses it. When we talk about domestic violence, in many, many cases, it is alcohol, which is the reason for that. Loss of respect for one another, breakdown of marriages and immoral behavior publicly. On a spiritual level, once a person goes into the state of intoxication, addiction comes in. And when a person is addicted to intoxication, I use this term, in the air traveling, the pilots have this option of autopilot system. Once the plane reaches to the desired, altitude, and they've already fixed it in the direction they want to go, they can put the plane on the autopilot mode, where they don't have to then manually, basically monitor they have to monitor, but they will not be manually leading it or flying it in that way. Similarly, I would say shaitan, when he targets a person, if he is able to make a person addicted to alcohol, this is the autopilot mode that he's putting that person. He doesn't have to worry about that person anymore. He's already put him on the direction, and of course his destination would be nothing but Jahannam. And that's why we see the emphasis which is there, even on a social level. The hadiths that we have from the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt are very clear. Don't give your daughter to somebody who is drunkard. Even friendship and association with such a person is shunned. And so this is where we have to realize that when we talk about the ill of intoxications and alcohol, the modern society will come around, but we are already there, 14 centuries ago, according to the wisdom and the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq to be among the true followers of Muhammad and ala Muhammad, inshaAllah. إن أحسن الحديث كتاب الله العزيز بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي لا إله إلا هو الحليم الكريم غافر الذنب وقابل التوبة وهو الغفور الرحيم ونشهد أن لا إله إلا هو العطوف للعباد بجوده والعواد على المذنبين بحلمه ونشهد أن محمدا نبيه وحبيبه سيد المرسلين وشفيع المذنبين ورحمة للعالمين صلى الله عليه وآله الداعين إلى سبيل الله بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة قادة الأمم وأولياء النعمة ومعدن الرحمة أوصيكم عباد الله بالتوبة ما سلف من ذنوبكم. When we talk about this issue of intoxication and the problems, I don't mean to say it's just a problem here. Unfortunately, even the Muslim world suffers from the same thing. Most of these very popular Muslim airlines, mashallah, when it comes to what they serve and they offer to the passengers, there's no hesitation at all. And sometimes you are surprised when they look at you and still they say, do you like to have something? What about you? Look at And it seems that for them also, even the so-called person who looks like a Muslim would still be imbibing that. I remember a very interesting situation in 1989. I was traveling from Tehran to Karachi, visiting Karachi for a program there. And those days, apparently, PIA was coming from Europe to Tehran and Tehran to Karachi. So there were European travelers also. And this is the time when Ziaul Haq was the president. Nizam Mustafa and religious, laws were there being imposed. And the seat that I was sitting in, there were 3 young Pakistani fellows in the front one. And when the issue of meal came up, they saw, they were serving alcohol also. And so they were talking about themselves, Nizam Mustafa, it is all forbidden. What is going on? So one of them said, well, you don't even realize it's haram on the land. We are in the air. So this halal haram doesn't apply here. This is the mentality. People really, when they want to do something, and this is where, even last year, I think, or the year before, there was one of the graduates of Al-Azhar University, Sheikh, in Egypt. Of course, he doesn't represent Al-Azhar University or the Mufti's perspective there, but he was adamant. He says, yes, khamr is haram in the Quran, but little bit of it is okay, as long as you don't become drunk. But that is where shaitan comes in. That is where he puts you on the autopilot. So we have to be, vigilant from even these kinds of muftis or scholars who would like to, go with the current trend. Going back to this issue, we had The chief public health officer here in Canada, Dr. Gregory Taylor, he actually mentioned something very interesting. He says, because the majority of Canadians drink and choose to drink, I would like to see a conversation started. There is a need to start a dialogue or a discussion, which really hasn't happened actually. And that was about defining alcohol. At the moment, alcohol is part of, is classified as food. But he says, so you have food and drugs, which are separate and is classified separately. Alcohol is still considered to be part of the food category. He says, whereas, if you look at alcohol, it contains psychotic, chemicals, which can alter thinking, mood, behavior, and even lead to dependency and abuse. And so the suggestion was that he was saying we shouldn't be saying that alcoholic drinks are part of food. They should be part of drugs. And this is where we see, Quran uses the term khamr. And khamr literally means, the veil or a cover. And so, for example, even the covering for the women is known as khimar. And basically, the reason why Quran uses the term khamr for intoxicants, because it covers the mind and alters the thinking and behavior of the person. Arabs have a saying where they say, al-khamr takhmur al-aql. Wine or intoxicants puts a cover on the intellect. They can't, think in the right way. And this is where we have to realize that, all these declarations by the medical science at the moment, this makes us proud regarding our faith and the Quran, which is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Salawat. A very brief note, I think there is another kind of intoxication, not necessarily by alcohol. And the example you see is the situation in the United States of America. You have this president-elect supported by the right wing, which consists also of a large segment of Bible Belt in the United States of America. On the one hand, they claim to be, Christian, following the Bible, and they have brought somebody into power who, from all perspective, as far as morality and ethics is concerned, is down. And he has been sentenced today. But because of his position as the president-elect, there is no jail, no fine, nothing. But the issue that what he did was criminal act, that could not be erased. And the judge was very clear today in saying that we can't alter the record. We can't impose any jail time or fine or anything like that. And yet, the community, the country is still there and supporting him in that way. And this is where we see that, when we talk about inhitat, when a society really declines to that level, that they would tolerate a leader of that kind. I'm not really surprised when I hear all the statements from the new president who is going to be in office at the end of this month, talking about Canada becoming the 51st state, or talking about taking Greenland, or even changing the name of Panama Canal and, or the name of Gulf of Mexico. The surprise is not that person. We should be surprised about the nation which have brought him to power. And that is a different level of intoxication when it comes to, how people look at things. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, hasten the appearance of the Imam so that we can have, peace on a global level, inshallah. I would like to end, since I talked about alcohol, besides the effort by an individual who is suffering from this problem, anybody who is addicted to alcohol, if that person is a Shia, yes, he has to go through a process, try to reform himself, get some counseling and everything. But a very powerful way of getting away from that has been taught to us by Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida alayhi salatu wasalam. In a narration from Fadl bin Shawan, he talks about the Imam talking about the events of Karbala. Especially he describes the scene when the head of Imam Hussain alayhi salam was brought to Yazid. And there he says that, he and his company sitting there, they were playing chess and drinking. And the tray on which the head of Imam Hussain was brought, close to him on the floor. And Imam says that there was a point where he would actually, the Mal'oon would even spill some drops from the khamr on the blessed face of Hussein ibn Ali alayhi salam. And this is where the Imam says, Man nadhara ila al-fuqa aw ila shatranj, anyone who looks at wine or intoxicants or at chess, فَلْيَذْكُرِ الْحُسَيْنَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ, he should remember Hussein. وَيَلْعَنْ يَزِيدُ وَآلَ زِيَادٍ, and he should curse Yazid and his Al Ziyad. And this is where we are talking about فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْ شِيعَتِنَا فَيَتَوَرَّعْ عَنْ شُرْبِ الْفُقَى. And this is where, that scene, if a person is still really a Shia, he loves Hussein ibn Ali, that scene in his mind should be strong enough to prevent him from extending his hand to the glass of wine or beer. I would say in a slightly different way that hand of yours, which goes on your chest, doing the matam and the latmiya, should not be the hand, which should have the glass of alcohol or beer or wine. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep all the Shias away from the temptation of the shaitan, inshallah. اللهم صل على سيد المرسلين وشفيع المذنبين نبينا محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم. وعلى إمام المتقين وأمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب صلوات الله عليه. وعلى سيدة نساء العالمين سيدتنا فاطمة بنت رسول الله صلوات الله عليها. وعلى سيد الشباب أهل الجنة الحسن المجتبى والحسين الشهيد بكربلاء عليهم الصلاة والسلام. اللهم صل على أئمة المسلمين علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي عليهم الصلاة والسلام. اللهم صل على مولانا الحجة بن الحسن صاحب العصر والزمان. ماحي آثار البدء والطغيان هادي بأبنية الشرك والنفاق حاسد فر البغي والشقاق صلوات الله وسلامه عليه وعلى آباء الكرام ما اتصلت الليالي والأيام. اللهم عجل فرج وسهل مخرجا واكحل ناظرنا بنظرة منا إليه واجعلنا من المستشهدين بين يديه. اللهم اجعلنا ممن يذكر فتنفعه الذكرى. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون.